more of our folks will be here. But I want to thank you all for being here today. This is incredibly important, some of the things we get a chance to talk about. And the issue today, to me, is incredible. I think this is one of the most complicated issues that's come up. And while I try to avoid that when I'm back home, people will still ask me to do it. And I said, listen, I live in a world of acronyms. I have no idea, nor neither do you, as to what's going on. But we will try to address at least the start of it today on a global tax situation that makes no sense to me for America. So I want to thank you all for being here today. We'll be talking about OECD's Pillar 1 negotiations. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and myself to hear our witnesses' testimony and perspective on OECD Pillar 1 and what the Biden administration's negotiations mean for America. So just clearly starting off, and I asked Elise, who's put all this together, who she serves with me in our office, if you could put some glossary together so we could look at all these acronyms and give us some kind of an idea of what it is that we're talking about, and it's almost impossible to do. But the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is the OECD. The Biden administration is negotiating a bad business deal for America with U.S. companies and taxpayers will foot the bill. This Pillar 1 deal, negotiated at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and was originally intended to eliminate the digital service tax to create a fair playing field globally. But in reality, their proposal will not equalize the playing field. This tax burden will fall disproportionately on American companies, which are nearly half of the largest and most profitable in the world. I bought several things today that just props, and if we can, do we have the one? So this is Atlas with the whole world on his back. And instead of Atlas, let's imagine this as America. And somehow we are saddled with the idea that if it's to be, it is up to us, and we must be the participants at an unusual level in order to make some of these things work. I'm sorry, I was born in America, my business is all America, everything I've done is America, and if it hadn't been for America, there would probably be not the world that exists today because of World War I and World War II, and we continue down a road which is really scary. The Biden Treasury Department has worked with OECD and foreign governments to craft this Pillar 1 proposal instead of with the legislative body, which represents the Americans that will have to pay for this deal. And in my eyes, the worst part of this negotiation is Treasury's complete lack of cooperation with Congress on OECD Pillar 1. The Biden administration leapfrogged Congress and put the interests of foreign governments ahead of the concerns of the men and women elected to represent Americans' taxpayers. We will do our due diligence to protect American companies and consumers and ensure they get a good deal. Let's state the facts here. 2/3 majority is required in the Senate for enactment of Pillar 1. In today's political environment, it is hard to believe that we get that much support even on naming a post office, let alone an international tax treaty. It's simply not feasible without taking into consideration frequent and significant input from Congress. The aspect I find most ironic, Pillar 1 falls apart without the United States' invested interest. Literally, the proposal written by OECD requires the United States to be involved in the final deal. But why, you may ask, without America's taxing rights under Pillar 1 collapses? That tells me everything I need to know, and if we can, we'll give Atlas a break. I just want you to look at the number of countries that are involved with this, and it would be an interesting exercise for somebody to take a look at this and understand where is America? Who props up? There's 145 different countries. I mean, I'm trying to look at some of these, and quite frankly, and not that I'm uneducated, but I have no idea who these countries are, where they're located, and more critically, why is it involved in any kind of a tax policy that we're trying to develop? So, thank you. Now, the Biden administration needs to be transparent with Congress on strategy on Pillar 1. Congress has requested revenue estimates from the Biden administration. They have failed to follow through on this request. Previously, Secretary Yellen acknowledged that if enacted, Pillar 1 would reduce U.S. revenues. Through Treasury's public comment period, U.S. businesses pointed to significant flaws with Pillar 1. Now, I'm concerned that the Biden Treasury is putting the interests of foreign governments before U.S. businesses and the American economy. Just this week in the Wall Street Journal, it was noted the benefit to America still hasn't appeared. The OECD deal that Treasury and Secretary Yellen just signed the United States up for. So we still don't know, how does that help us? But the facts are simple. Through Pillar 1 negotiation, U.S. companies would bear far more than our fair share out of the 145 countries involved, and confirmed this week by JCT estimates. More specifically, if Pillar 1 would have been in place in 2021, the U.S. would have lost $1.4 billion in tax revenues. At the end of the day, folks, this is about the U.S. economy's security. Is the Biden administration going to sacrifice the financial success of U.S. businesses and our economy for international accounting bureaucrats' approval, or for Europe to benefit from our economic success? And we're not going to stand by idly and watch the Biden administration and Treasury Department sacrifice American tax dollars for political gain. And I believe we will find out today that my colleagues feel exactly the same way. This deal diminishes the economic security of the United States at a time of global instability, and we just cannot take that risk. I look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses to discuss with this subcommittee their expertise when it comes to OECD and international tax, and I really appreciate their outlook on Pillar 1. So now I'd like to recognize my friend from California, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Chairman Kelly, thank you very much for holding today's hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing is about a topic of great importance. It's a very technical and weedy topic, but that's exactly what this subcommittee is for, doing a deep dive on some of the thorniest tax topics facing our nation. The proliferation of digital service taxes over the past 5 years is concerning to members on both sides of the aisle. These taxes, as imposed, discriminate against some of the most innovative American businesses and act as a quick and politically convenient revenue grab for the governments who impose them. Pillar 1 of the OECD's inclusive framework is the world's attempt to agree to roll back these discriminatory taxes by creating a novel framework to reallocate a share of the most profitable companies' profits to the jurisdictions where their customers live. The human resources that have been put into this, into devising this brand new international tax frame are astounding. The Biden administration and other delegates at the OECD should be commended for their tireless dedication to the task. Their goal is an admirable one, providing stability to the international tax system. With a stable tax system, everyone wins. Business wins when it knows what its tax bill will be, when it seeks to invest in foreign markets. Governments win when they know they can rely on a stable revenue stream to fund their operations. And everyone wins when we avoid costly and protracted transfer pricing disputes, which waste both government and private resources. Any multilateral negotiation such as this one discussed here is bound to be a tough one. No doubt members will be discussing the JCT's report that was released to accompany this hearing, showing that the flow of funds between the United States and other jurisdictions will generally be negative for the U.S. We are, in JCT's estimation, going to be losing $1.4 billion each year under the Pillar 1 agreement. For some, that might be the end of the discussion. Why give up revenue to other countries, they'll ask. My view is that we need to understand the benefits of the agreement and not just look at the cost. What are the benefits of the international stability the agreement could potentially provide? For instance, Amount B, if other countries will accede to the Biden administration's red line to make Amount B mandatory, could present a real benefit for U.S. businesses by significantly reducing transfer pricing disputes. And perhaps more important, those who look at the JCT report and say that we should pack our bags and go home should ask themselves, what's the alternative? Are advocates for abandoning Pillar 1 then suggesting that the patchwork of DST that will doubtlessly spring into place are preferable to the Pillar 1 proposal? And if not, how do you believe that the United States can stave off those taxes? To be clear, I'm not arguing that the administration should sign just any agreement. A final Pillar 1 deal must provide protection against unilateral DST and promote a high level of tax certainty and stability without conceding on key U.S. interests. That being said, the questions I've raised are serious ones that must be addressed if one advocates abandoning the OECD process. And the very nature of those questions is why I remain supportive of the administration staying at the table and devoting themselves to this crucially important endeavor. As they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I'd just like to ask that if we do this again, I would hope that we would invite the Treasury Department, who's representing us at representing us at the OECD matter. If you recall, we had them before when we discussed this, and I found them to be very helpful. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you, witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you. And Ms. Yeldon will be here very quickly at the beginning of April, so we'll have a chance to talk to her about that. I'd like now to introduce the panel. I want to tell you, thank you all for being here. You give up a day of your life to come here. Now, clocks and calendars don't seem to matter in this business. We had it scheduled for 2 o'clock, but then we were asked to go and vote, which is kind of really why we were elected. So I want to thank you for coming here today to discuss with us. And I find it to be a very complicated issue, but Megan Funkhauser is with us today, and she's a Senior Director of Policy, Tax, and Trade at the Informational Technology Industry Council. Rick Miner is a Senior Vice President, International Tax Council at the United States Council for International Business. Thank you. Gary Sprague is partner at Baker McKenzie. Daniel Bunn is President and CEO of the Tax Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today. Your written statements will be part of today's hearing, and you each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Ms. Funkhauser, please.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the Tax Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Megan Funkhauser, and I lead international tax policy for the Information Technology Industry Council, also known as ITI. In this role, I represent the global technology industry's perspectives before policymakers in the United States and abroad, including on the efforts in the OECD G20 inclusive framework that are the subject of today's hearing. ITI's membership comprises leading companies from all corners of the technology sector, including hardware, software, digital services, semiconductor, platform, network equipment, cloud, cybersecurity, and other internet and technology-enabled companies that drive innovation and rely on technologies to evolve their businesses. ITI's membership includes many of the largest U.S. corporate taxpayers and top investors in research and development, contributing to U.S. competitiveness and the strength of the U.S. economy. That is why we greatly appreciate this committee's leadership in advancing the pro-growth tax package that passed the House earlier this year. Thank you for convening today's hearing to discuss updating international tax rules through Pillar 1. ITI greatly appreciates members' interest in and engagement with the Inclusive Framework's efforts, from participating in meetings in Paris and Berlin to encouraging the Treasury Department to hold a consultation on the draft multilateral convention to implement Amount A of Pillar 1, as well as sending many congressional letters and statements, particularly those expressing strong bipartisan opposition to digital services taxes. Absent robust U.S. engagement, including that of Congress, there is little chance of resolving outstanding issues with Pillar 1 and crafting a final package that provides certainty and predictability for taxpayers. That is why I'm glad the committee is holding this hearing today. All of ITI's member companies rely on clear and established tax rules to innovate and grow their operations. However, the proliferation of digital services taxes has contributed to the fragmentation of the international tax system by departing from long-standing international tax norms such as neutrality, efficiency, certainty, and simplicity. The first generation of digital services taxes targeted globally engaged companies that provide services like digital advertising and digital intermediary services. Subsequent iterations expanded to capture nearly all non-resident companies engaging with the market. We have also seen governments adopt novel approaches to introduce extraterritorial means of corporate taxation, which contribute to uncertainty and instability for taxpayers. Congress's consistent, bipartisan opposition to digital services taxes and other novel approaches has undoubtedly helped to stem the further proliferation of these damaging measures, as have the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 investigations. Ultimately, global tax policy challenges require global tax policy solutions, which is why ITI supports reaching a multilateral, consensus-based solution that withdraws digital services taxes and prevents their future introduction. In light of alternatives, ITI sees potential in the draft multilateral convention for developing a multilateral, consensus-based framework to alleviate the negative consequences of the increasingly fragmented and controversy-heavy international tax environment. I would like to request to submit ITI's response to Treasury's consultation for the record, but want to highlight here 3 buckets. 1, relieving double taxation. 2, securing the removal of digital services taxes and relevant similar measures. And 3, ensuring tax certainty. First, ITI firmly believes that income should be taxed once. We have concerns with the extent of relief in some circumstances where a company is already paying taxes on residual profits in a jurisdiction, as well as the menu of options and limited commitments that governments have to fully relieve double taxation. 2, on the removal of digital services taxes, ITI recommends strengthening the definition of prohibited measures to reduce subjectivity, as well as introduce an enforcement mechanism to give greater weight to the political commitment to withdraw a digital services tax or relevant similar measure. Third, and finally, the approach under consideration in Pillar 1 would represent a significant overhaul of international tax rules. Providing certainty, particularly advanced certainty, for taxpayers and tax administrations alike as they adapt to new rules will be critical for supporting an environment that fosters investment and innovation. Taking a step back to consider the bigger picture, ITI also supports extending the standstill on the imposition of newly enacted digital services taxes, discouraging the Canadian government from advancing its digital services tax proposal, securing a robust Amount B, and confirming the treatment of Pillar 1 taxation for the purposes of Pillar 2. Again, absent robust U.S. engagement, including that of Congress, there's little chance of resolving these outstanding issues and crafting a final package that provides certainty and predictability for taxpayers. Thank you again for the invitation to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bunkhouse. Mr. Minor, you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Subcommittee Chairman Kelly, Ranking Subcommittee Member Thompson, and other members of the Subcommittee on Tax. Thank you for the invitation to testify at this hearing on Pillar 1. My name is Rick Minor. I am the International Tax Counsel for the U.S. Council for International Business. Pillar 1 is the attempt to change the international tax system to reallocate taxation rights to the market jurisdictions and eliminate the discriminatory network of digital service taxes and other similar measures. Such measures threaten to expand globally, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and further destabilize the international tax system. The Multilateral Convention provides a legal framework and detailed rules for the implementation of the so-called Amount A taxing right and the removal of DSTs. Amount A is a novel regime that applies on top of the existing U.S. international tax rules for in-scope U.S. multinationals. Amount B is a simplified set of rules outside the MLC for the common pricing of routine cross-border distribution services. USCIB makes 4 recommendations in reference to Pillar 1. Number 1, the elimination of double taxation is a high priority for U.S. multinationals. Let me repeat that. The elimination of double taxation is a high priority for U.S. multinationals. A Pillar 1 solution that does not effectively eliminate double taxation in its application is not sustainable over the long run. USCIB members remain concerned that the draft MLC does not adequately deliver on the objective to avoid double taxation. This should be a key priority for governments and the U.S. business community when considering Pillar 1. Number 2, the definition of DSTs and other relevant similar measures in the draft MLC must be revised. The prevention and rollback of DSTs must be comprehensive, or the MLC will fail to stabilize the international tax system. One of the critical objectives of the Pillar 1 project is to remove harmful tax measures that target U.S. companies. These taxes are becoming more common, and the MLC should ensure that DSTs and other measures are withdrawn and not enacted in the future. The MLC should not enable countries to make a choice between Amount A and DSTs. The message from the U.S. should be that discrimination against U.S. companies should not be permitted in any case. Fiscal measures specifically targeted at U.S. multinationals should never be a legitimate tax policy in a stable international tax system. We note our disappointment that Canada has not respected the DST standstill agreement that was recently extended. Their continued insistence on moving forward with their DST puts at risk the principles of the broader project of Pillar 1. Number 3, the scope of Amount B needs to be expanded. Progress could be achieved now with the creation of a robust and explicit roadmap of future design features, including the extension of Amount B to retail sales as well as to sales of digital goods and services. Amount B is an important component of Pillar 1, given the potential for it to deliver significant tax administration efficiencies. Tax controversies regarding routine distribution structures are time-consuming for tax administrations and taxpayers alike. All involved could benefit from the use of pricing safe harbors that are broadly respected across jurisdictions. We are concerned that the current design of Amount B falls short of the stated objectives of the OECD in its original blueprint. The OECD and Inclusive Framework must continue their efforts to negotiate and ultimately agree upon an Amount B design that is acceptable to all stakeholders and adopted globally. Number 4, USCIB encourages the Biden administration and U.S. Congress to remain engaged in the OECD process. The common mission is to ensure a comprehensive and durable multilateral solution to these complex international challenges now and going forward. Since the Pillar 1 solution was proposed, USCIB has offered practical solutions to advance the design of its components. Although we have not had a seat at the table in these years-long Inclusive Framework government negotiations, we can imagine a reality in which these rules can exist in some form if the final rules stabilize the international tax system. We are available for any further requests for discussion on these topics beyond this hearing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Mr. Sprague, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the OECD's Pillar 1 project. I'm a partner with Baker McKenzie based in Palo Alto, California. I have practiced international tax law for over 40 years. I'm an adjunct professor of tax law at the UC College of the Law, San Francisco. My testimony will address Amount B as described in the February 19th report. I provide these comments on my own behalf, and they do not necessarily reflect the views of Baker McKenzie or its clients. Amount B proposes a simplified and streamlined approach to set the transfer price to be paid by a market state distribution entity to acquire goods or services from a related non-resident supplier for resale in the market state. The essential promise of Amount B is to increase certainty and reduce controversy for taxpayers and tax administrations with respect to relatively straightforward transactions. It potentially applies to all MNC groups, not just the small number of Amount A taxpayers. Amount B is also an integral part of the Pillar 1 project to restore stability to the international tax framework. The instabilities arising from DSTs and other unilateral measures are well known. Less well publicized are the instabilities created by aggressive transfer pricing positions taken by various foreign tax administrations related to the inbound distribution of goods and services, particularly those of U.S. MNCs. Amount B is designed to stabilize cross-border tax risk arising from those transactions. In its current state, however, the Amount B proposal is not likely to achieve its stated goals. The 3 major issues are the narrow scope of industries covered by Amount B. Adopting the rules is completely optional for all jurisdictions, and the possibility that a further subjective element will be introduced to the scoping criteria. U.S. Treasury has publicly remarked on those deficiencies. The Amount B report expressly excludes the distribution of software and digital services. This exclusion precludes Amount B benefits for some of the most innovative and dynamic sectors in the U.S. economy. This also removes Amount B protections from many of the U.S. enterprises which have experienced the sort of aggressive transfer pricing assertions outside the United States that helped inspire the idea of Amount B in the first place. At a minimum, any Amount A taxpayer in any sector should be brought within scope of Amount B. The second significant deficiency is the permission granted to all jurisdictions to opt out of the Amount B regime. That optionality will impair the benefits of predictability and stability for U.S. MNCs. These are not theoretical concerns. Immediately upon the release of the report, New Zealand announced that it will not participate in the Amount B project and will not regard any application of the Amount B pricing matrix as evidence of arm's length pricing. Australia followed soon thereafter with a statement that it favors optionality. The third major issue is the possibility that an additional optional qualitative scoping criterion might be added to the Amount B rules. The effect will be to introduce a subjective step that jurisdictions may use to exclude distributors from Amount B. India has stated its support for this approach. So here are some suggestions for a way forward. There is no need for negotiations over the terms of Amount B to cease. Amount B will be incorporated into the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, not in a multilateral treaty. The scope of Amount B could be widened to include digital goods and services in the future. If the initial Amount B guidance retains its current limited scope, the OECD should commit to a work stream and provide a timeline to identify the appropriate comparables for the distribution of digital goods and services so that those sectors can be brought into the simplified and streamlined approach. I was pleased to see recent comments by U.S. Treasury that the U.S. is still working towards a mandatory Amount B. Further, the IRS should consider negotiating competent authority agreements with major U.S. trading partners to achieve broader coverage and mandatory treatment on a bilateral or multilateral basis. Those agreements can build on the work already accomplished at the OECD. The pricing mechanism described in the Amount B report is well-founded in transfer pricing theory and could easily be integrated into a competent authority agreement. U.S. leadership on that point will be useful to counteract the negative drag on the initiative created by tax administrations publicly embracing optionality or opting out together. Thank you for your attention, and I would be pleased to respond to any questions from the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Sprague. Mr. Budd, you're recognized.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Tax, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the OECD's Pillar 1 project. I am Daniel Bunn, President and CEO of the Tax Foundation. I think it's best to think about this project in the context of what policymakers might value. And there's three different things that you might value. You may choose differently, but I think there's three things in this context that you might value, and I'll run through them and provide a little context for each. First, I think on a bipartisan and bicameral basis, there's a value to eliminating discriminatory digital services taxes. And I think as you hear from the witnesses today, you've heard that there's more work to be done. That there is not, while Amount A does provide a potential path to eliminating some digital services, there is much more work to be done to accomplish that goal if this is going to be the path forward. I know some members on the Republican side of this committee have worked on legislation to beef up U.S. potential retaliatory tools to countries that have unilaterally impose these digital services taxes unfairly against U.S. businesses. And tools like that can be useful, but I'm concerned, given the progress that has been made and the lack of progress in some cases with removing digital services, that an approach like that could spill into another round of a tax and trade war. Another thing that you might value is control over what is the U.S. tax base. This subcommittee, the full committee, is given the responsibility for writing U.S. tax laws. What this deal would require would be, as a multilateral negotiation, some changes to the U.S. tax base and impacts on U.S. tax revenues that have already been described. Chairman Kelly, you appropriately mentioned that there would be an outsized burden on U.S. businesses. The Joint Committee's analysis points this out, where 70% of the profits that they measured that would be in scope for Amount A would be from U.S. businesses or U.S. business segments. Now, the $1.4 billion in revenue loss, JCT's preferred estimate, is not massive, but it is meaningful, and I think it's even more meaningful if you think of the interplay between Amount A and the global minimum tax. These things change incentives. The global minimum tax and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changed incentives for where U.S. businesses or where multinationals generally might want to put their high-value assets or their high-return activities. And if more of the high-value assets and high-return activities are in the U.S. then over time, and if that trend continues over time, then there will be potentially more exposure for the U.S. tax base in the context of Amount A. So we need to think about these things in tandem. Those incentives are somewhat intertwined. Finally, you may value the benefit, sometimes the cost, of being engaged in multilateral forums. Obviously, getting a deal like this together requires give and take across different desires from different countries, continents, and jurisdictions that may not have otherwise been interested at all in some sort of multilateral agreement. The deal that's available now, while it has drawbacks, I think it's worth thinking of like what might happen if this falls apart. What might be next? Is it some sort of tax and trade war? Or I think it's worth the committee's time to look at what the United Nations is trying to do in setting up its own multilateral tax negotiation. I don't know what the future looks like without an Amount A, but it's important to think through the value or, in some cases, the cost of being engaged in a multilateral way. I will also mention that unilateral approaches, many of them taken by foreign governments, are not necessarily creating any sort of certainty for taxpayers. There's all sorts of mutations and multiplications of these digital services taxes, but there's a bias towards taxing additional profits or revenues in some cases in market jurisdictions. I think some members of this committee will remember the destination-based cash flow tax debate many years ago, back before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that was a bias towards taxing in the market as well. And the Joint Committee points out that that would have been more efficient than Pillar 1 Amount A. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you all for being here. You know, this is so complicated. I marvel at the way you all just go through it. It's like this, and this. But for the average American to sit back and try to understand what is it that we're trying to put together, and why is it that we're trying to put it together to begin with? The other question I have is there some reason the administration didn't actually work with Congress? Because this is kind of one of our basic responsibilities. It would have been nice to be included. So, having said all that, and try not to be a wise guy about this, but I'm serious about this. I cannot imagine bypassing this committee and saying, we'll let you know when we come up with a deal, and then you guys can just jump on and everything is going to be fine. So please help me to understand how enacting Pillar 1 in its current form is pragmatic for the U.S. economy, and more specifically for American businesses. Where is this, as I'm an America First guy, where is this that it somehow enhances our ability to compete globally and maintain our position? By the way, I don't want to just participate in a global economy. I want the United States to dominate it, because I think it's the only way we can save the world as we go forward. But any of you can help me understand this, because this is so bizarre to anything I've ever come up with in my life. And I would admit I don't have a degree in anything that you're talking about. I would never try to do my own taxes, because I know the danger, especially being a member of Congress, if you make a mistake. But any of you that can discuss, tell us more if you can. Where does this fit in to us, and where is it that it helps America?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. I think it's incredibly important, and why I'm so glad that we're having this hearing today, because as I mentioned in my remarks, I think the best way to have a better Amount A outcome that makes sense for the U.S. will be through congressional engagement and through opportunities like today to talk where U.S. industry sees the concerns with how it is currently drafted and work towards making it a better final package that does provide certainty and stability, because the U.S. U.S. economy benefits from the global economy. U.S. businesses are in the leadership, and so this is why we're excited to have this conversation today, is to talk through how can we make this a better package with you. So, thank you.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Sure. If
Yes.
I may, sir. The challenge here is avoiding what I described as a difficult digital tax and trade war. So where this began was some European countries interested in taxing in a discriminatory way some US companies. And then as the discussion developed, it was pretty clear that the way out of this was either going to be a multilateral agreement or some sort of trade war, and that's where the real impact to everyday Americans could have come down. You know, it's not really easy to say that, oh, well, we're working towards this multilateral agreement because of X, Y, or Z. But one of the things when we think of the prices that people face in the grocery stores or manufacturers face with their suppliers, tax and trade war can increase those things. And I think that's one reason to continue to seek a solution to avoid that kind of outcome.
Okay, listen, I appreciate support, and we have so many people that want to ask questions today, so I'm going to now have Mr. Thompson weigh in from his side of what his concerns are. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sprague, in your written testimony, you state that the number of mutual agreement procedures, or MAP cases, open for transfer pricing matters has spiked since 2016. You also point out that IRS figures show an increase in the number of cases related to distributors from approximately 39% in 18 to around 53% in 2022. I'd like to get a sense of the real-world impact of these disputes on our American businesses. Based on your experience as an international tax attorney, about how much time and money do our U.S. businesses spend on these protracted transfer pricing disputes, and what impact would such an increase have on the IRS?
Mr. Thompson, thank you for that question. Your question addresses a central purpose of the simplified and streamlined approach of Amount B. It's hard to quantify an average cost by company or by dispute, but there's no doubt that the costs are large, in many cases large enough to make a CFO wince. So let me describe the reason why these costs are so high. First, you referred to the MAP program, which that's the government-to-government process where the two tax administrations try to resolve a dispute, usually raised by the foreign tax administration. But the majority of the costs for American business are incurred before the case even makes it to MAP. MAP is the ultimate recourse. But before a MAP case arises, the taxpayers had to address these issues on audit in front of the foreign tax administration. Those are the costs that Amount B is trying to contain. The costs are high because transfer pricing issues are intensely factual and there's lots of room for interpretation. So at both the audit and MAP levels, there are substantial costs of internal resources as well as external fees. Some jurisdictions are notoriously more challenging than others. Both internal and external costs are higher for audits in those jurisdictions. If Amount B succeeds, I would expect a reduction of burdens on taxpayers because the purpose is to provide the simplified, streamlined approach to transfer pricing for inbound distribution. And I also expect a reduction of burdens on the IRS. Because if we can resolve more of these cases on audit, fewer cases then have to come to MAP, and the U.S. won't have to devote the same resources to MAP. For those cases that do make it to MAP, I would still expect that those issues would be narrowed at the IRS to foreign administration level because there'd be a more narrow game plan or course, if you will, to settle those disputes within the simplified and streamlined approach. So while I can't give you a precise number, across all of U.S. multinationals, it's very large, and I expect the largest reductions in cost would be at the company level, but significantly reduced at the IRS level as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bunn, USTR found that the digital service tax adopted by Austria, India, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the UK were subject to action under Section 301 because they discriminated against U.S. digital companies, were inconsistent with principles of international taxation, and burdened U.S. companies. What would it take for a digital service tax to not be discriminatory against U.S. multinational corporations? Is it actually possible to have a DST that is not discriminatory against U.S. multinational corporations? And if such thing could exist, would their proliferation be a desired outcome?
Thank you for the question. In one sense, no. The U.S. has an outsized share of these large digital companies, so if you have even a digital services tax that doesn't have a revenue threshold, there would be some de facto discrimination against U.S. companies. But if you would say that even that de facto discrimination doesn't count, there's no revenue threshold or something like that, the proliferation of such a policy would still be bad. This is a tax on gross revenues, and countries should not be taxing businesses on their gross revenues. Net income tax is where the policy should be focused, or including digital services in the context of a value-added tax or something of that nature.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Spiker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You ever have one of those occasions, every time you think you start to understand something, your head starts to spin? Mr. Sprague, I'm partially going to, because of your specialty, we were back here trying to have a conversation of different ways you could have leakage, but I first want to make sure I understand some of the most basic part of the math. I have an 11% gross rate of return. So 1% is now subject, and I take 20% of the 1%, and then that's now subject to an allocation internationally. Is that a fair way to, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. Am I okay so far? For the
Yes.
base 10% that is basically sheltered, you say it's gross, but is it a classic gross as we would do our accounting in the United States of my capital expenditures, my interest costs, my carrying costs, my personal costs, my healthcare costs, those as my base expenses, shielded within, so I can get up to 10% rate of return before I'm subject to the formula?
Well, yes. You're referring to the amount A formula now, correct? Not the
Yes,
amount
just
B.
the A.
Yeah, and so the 10% is indeed on operating income, so that is after all of the normal book expenses have been deducted. So the 10% figure in your case would be profit after all normal expenses, and then if your company was in scope, $20 billion, and had 11% operating profit,
Then I have one.
then indeed that 1% would be subject to amount A
And
allocation.
20% of the one.
25% of
25% of the one.
Correct.
Sorry. Okay. Now, if I came to you and said, you're my counsel, find me a way as a, let's pretend I'm an AI company. So I can put my stacks anywhere, I can put my servers here, I can move my IP anywhere, and house it anywhere. Is there a way, as you understand the model right now, to somewhat game this system?
Not really, not by moving assets like that around, because the pool of profits is global. Profit is the entire consolidated profit of the group. So you could establish a new operation in a different country and maybe earn income in that country instead of a different country, but the allocation under amount A is based on global consolidated profit.
You see, part of this was derivative was Mr. Bunn had said, if I'm in a different country, and do I have different things that I could stack up as part of my expenses, my cost of doing business? Either that or that country has certain different types of credit mechanics or that would change my definition of the first base of the 10%. Does that make sense, Mr. Ben?
So I'd distinguish between what it looks like for the company, which Mr. Sprague just described, and the country. So what I was getting at is it depends for the country and the country's tax revenues where you have your high value, high margin things. The allocation for the company, regardless of where they have their stuff, it'll still be 25% of that 1%.
Okay.
But if all 11% of those profits are in the US, then it will matter for the US Treasury
Okay.
for that 1%.
Ms. Funkhauser, and here's where we've been sort of trying to game this out in our heads and see if we're missing anything. If I'm in a world, it's a decade from now, and I'm running parts of my factory on AI or other types of technology in the future, or I have a company that's doing synthetic biology and those things. Is the design of this model, do you believe it is robust enough to handle the economic disruptions that we all expect over this decade?
On the part of the model you're describing, yes, because it just starts with, for U.S. companies, GAAP financial statements.
Okay.
So whether you're a potato chip manufacturer or an AI company or some other enterprise, it doesn't really make any difference.
Well, because in that AI model, you almost could have no domicile other than wherever the processors are, and the IP can, in a weird way, can almost float.
Well, I mean, I doubt a $20 billion enterprise would ever not have a domicile somewhere. I think what you're referring to is the potential to move, as Mr. Bone was describing, productive assets from one country to another, and that would produce more or less income in the particular country. But for Amount A purposes, you don't start with a particular country income. You start with the combined worldwide consolidated group and your GAAP financials.
All right.
So the consequence would be if you put, say, by virtue of AI or whatever, all of your income in one country, but you still had to allocate out some amount to other countries under Amount A, then it's that one country that would be the country that has to, relieve double taxation due to the allocation out to other countries.
But, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your tolerance. Actually, that was actually very helpful. So,
Thank you. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized for
Well,
5
thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of our witnesses for your very insightful testimony. It seems to me whether you're a small business on Main Street or a multinational spanning the globe, one of the most important things is to have some stability, some certainty, so that when decisions are made about investing in plant and equipment, expanding a workforce, you have some sense of how much risk you're experiencing. And the less chaos we can have, the better. And avoiding a number of countries coming forward and taxing on their own instead of working this out is really anti-business in nature. That kind of conflicts with what's been going on here in the Congress. Over the last year, we've had a substantial chaos caucus. Took us right up to the brink of defaulting on the full faith and credit of the United States for the first time in our history. Has taken us again and again right to the brink of shutting down the government. In fact, right now, we don't know if the government was shut down by the end of the month on more than half of the budget that should have been approved last September for the remainder of this fiscal year. And I hate to see that kind of chaos added to what is already a challenging multinational situation. Ms. Funkhauser, you have referred to the need for global tax solutions, and I think you're absolutely right. Let me just ask you if you believe that the United States suddenly withdrawing from the OECD process would be harmful to U.S. business.
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. And I would say yes, that would be very harmful from U.S. business, because when you think about how to secure the best outcomes for U.S. business and U.S. competitiveness, it comes from the U.S. being part of the conversation and driving the outcomes that benefit the U.S. economy and the U.S. people. And so as we think about certainty, to your point, it is looking at how can we provide certainty for these companies.
And Mr. Bunn, you've used what is a very controversial term here in Congress with some, and that is the term multilateralism. We have some people that don't believe in anything international, don't even support NATO these days, but you say multilateralism is better than multiple rounds of a tax and trade war. Do you agree with Ms. Funkhauser that it would be extremely harmful to U.S. business interests to suddenly withdraw from the OECD negotiations that are still very much underway.
I think at this point, there's a lot of work to be done, and that requires remaining engaged. The challenge is whether the goals that Congress has for the Treasury to achieve, whether those will be achieved. At some point, there will be a final deal, and that's when the decision, I think, should be made.
And Mr. Minor, while there's still much more work to be done, do you also agree that it would be a mistake for the United States to just fold up its tent and withdraw from the OECD?
Yes, that's a clear position of my members, and we don't have a final MLC. The Amount B rules are still in flux, so that is our recommendation, is to stay the course of the multilateral process for now, but also have a meaningful engagement between Congress and Treasury.
Each of you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put into the record a letter that has been sent to the Appropriations Committee by a number of members, including 5 from this tax subcommittee, that are urging that we end all funding for OECD and essentially withdraw from the negotiations because we won't be funding it anymore. I think that would be a serious mistake. I think it's anti-business in nature. It's contrary to the needs of our business community. We need to stay engaged. We cannot wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. Our business community certainly can't do that, and they need our support. These negotiations have not achieved their full objectives yet, but that doesn't mean that you quit. We need to continue to be involved. I would say also that there are a number of American companies who would owe tax here under Pillar 1 as currently prepared, as best I can tell, including American pharmaceutical companies that book most of their profits abroad and pay tax on little reported profit here. For example, AbbVie sells 75% of its drugs here in the United States, yet for years it's reported a loss in the United States with billions in profits booked abroad. So Pillar 1 is not just about additional tax revenue for other countries. It has some potential, particularly in the pharmaceutical area here in the United States. I hope these negotiations continue and the efforts by Republican colleagues to undermine OECD will be defeated. I yield back.
Mr. Hearn, recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here. Really appreciate it. Since I've been on Ways and Means, I've been following this Pillar 1 issue and written multiple letters to Treasury to ask for their revenue modeling so that we better understood where their estimates are coming from and the impact of the OECD Pillar 1 agreement. And I've introduced legislation to force the Treasury to provide this information to Congress. I think it's important that we know what they're using to determine the impact. And after years of the pressure, the Treasury finally provided the needed information to JCT. Yesterday, JCT released a report providing background and analysis of the taxation of multinational enterprises and the potential reallocation of taxing rights under Pillar 1. JCT estimates that enactment of Pillar 1, Amount A, would have resulted in a revenue loss of $1.4 billion to the U.S. fisc in 2021, ultimately confirming that this is a bad deal for Americans. Putting the projected losses to the U.S. fisc aside, there is good reason and motivation to find a solution that would convince countries to remove and or deter implementation of digital service taxes that target our U.S. businesses with malign intent. But herein lays the problem. The treaty as it is written now does not completely solve the problem, which is to eradicate all novel extraterritorial digital service taxes and other discriminatory measures. Also, I'm concerned that countries will still be able to aggressively target U.S. companies while claiming their revenue reallocation. It is clear that the negotiation was conceived as an economical solution and one worth pursuing, but has quickly turned into a political negotiation with massive amounts of complexity and key economic principles missing from the final product. It's always going to be an uphill battle getting 140 countries to agree on an international agreement that stands on complete economic principles, because every country has different preferences that fit their needs, their wants, their politics, and economic agenda. Should we abandon all hopes of finding a solution to eradicate novel discriminatory taxes around the world? I would say no. but I have a deep concern with the treaty as it is presented at the OECD currently. Mr. Bunn, the draft treaty lists 9 DSTs and similarly discriminatory measures that are subject to be replaced by Pillar 1. The rules are written in a way that countries can adopt Pillar 1 or capitalize on the redistributed tax revenues or have the option to keep their DSTs in place. I find this leniency to be problematic since overreaching goal is to find compromise where all DSTs and discriminatory taxes are eliminated. Does the draft treaty, as written, lead you to believe that all DSTs will be removed? And is there a door number 2, so to speak, for new discriminatory tax measures to be implemented in the future?
Thank you for the question. No, I do not think the draft treaty would eliminate all discriminatory taxes. And yes, I do think that it leaves open the possibility for new, either mutated forms or proliferated forms of digital services taxes.
And I do agree with Ms. Funkhauser that we do need to stay at the table, that we figure out what's going on, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, as the old saying goes. And so we're the ones that are the targets of these DSTs primarily, and we have to have a way to figure these out as opposed to creating a trade war. Mr. Bunn, also under a formulaic system such as Amount A, the formula can be manipulated. Is there also concern that governments could modify their current DST to work around the current definition?
Yes, you could apply your DST to foreign and domestic businesses and potentially use that as an escape route to be able to maintain a DST. And I think that could be the route that some countries that are looking at this deal would take.
Thank you. Mr. Minor, we've already heard that some countries such as Australia will likely opt out of using Amount B construct set aside by the OECD last month, opting instead to use their existing transfer pricing mechanisms. How does optionality like this undermine the certainty and stability that has long been the primary goal of this policy?
Yeah, well, it's very problematic, and we're not very happy about that because that kind of sends a signal to other members of the inclusive framework that that may be an option for whatever purpose. So action like that, unfortunately, significantly undermines the Pillar 1 principles, and we're surprised to see that happen, actually. But there's no guarantee that other countries might want to go that route. But it does undermine the principles of the Pillar 1 solution.
I think it's worth noting, Mr. Chairman, if I may have just 30 seconds, that as a group of us went to the OECD back in August, and it's a different conversation when you meet eye to eye with somebody versus sending text messages back and forth or certified letters, emails. And what's interesting with the OECD, and I brought this up to our leader of the OECD, who is a former consultant with one of our large large consulting groups in the United States, and my point to her is that I know that you know how important tax code is to making strategic decisions in companies, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so this is not any different. Based on how we determine and work this out in the United States involvement, will change and possibly change how companies do business around the world. And we need not give up our tax dollars in search of a solution to move around the world when we have done the right thing with guilty and fitty to make sure that we fix it. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But we've got to do the right thing and make sure that we keep our companies safe here, create jobs here, put Americans to work here, and collect appropriate taxes here. I thank you all so much.
Mr. Larson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all our witnesses as well. And I want to continue along the line of my colleague, Mr. Doggett, and say that I think, especially as we sit up here and ask our experts questions, that it seems to us that stability is optimal in this situation, and that we want to make sure as well that stability, certainty, and avoiding chaos, the chaos that will obviously come from any kind of trade war that would ensue because we haven't remained at the table and focused on working this through. So we cannot allow our American innovation that's fundamental to the fabric of our country to be curtailed or punished by unilateral taxation from dozens of other countries. I think we're all in agreement on that. But I have a process question, and Mr. Bunn, I'm going to direct it to you, but anyone can feel free to jump in as well. But the way it's been explained, to me at least, that Amount A would be delivered through a multilateral convention, or MLC, I guess as it's called, which would first be signed by the Treasury Department, then, similar to our bilateral tax treaties, be ratified by Congress. Is that correct, Mr. Bunn?
Ratified by the Senate.
Yes. So can you please explain the role of the House in this process and the role of the Senate as you see it?
So thank you for the question. So the Senate would have to ratify the treaty with 2/3 majority. The Senate has not been, does not have a great reputation for acting quickly on tax treaties. Does not have
our legislation in the House either, for that matter. But
I walked into that one. The other piece of this, and others on the panel may elaborate, would be implementing legislation. So there's part of this agreement that is us giving up our taxing right, but there's also legislative changes that would have to be done for us to claim the new taxing right.
Mr. Sprague?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. For us to tax inbound Amount A, we need to change our so-called effectively connected income rules to give us tax nexus over the other countries' allocation of Amount A to the United States. So the House, as the body responsible for originating tax legislation, would be in charge of that revision. And also in terms of, ratifying the treaty, I would think the expertise in the House, there's plenty of reason for you to be thinking carefully about these issues and, giving your advice to the Senate.
Mr. Minor?
Yeah, I would just echo that sentiment about the importance of the House and this committee specifically being very engaged on the development of the MLC, the next step, and including Amount B, and also considering what type of legislative changes would be necessary to possibly implement the MLC.
Thank you. Ms. Funkenhauser?
Yes, and I appreciate the question and believe that it is very important that the House and particularly the subcommittee is having this conversation because it has to do at the end of the day with U.S. competitiveness and how companies invested in the United States are able to engage with customers and consumers around the world. And so therefore, I'm very glad we're having this conversation today and see that as an important role of the subcommittee.
Do you ever sit here and wonder as witnesses what you would do in our role? Is there anything specific that you would say, I don't understand why Congress just doesn't do fill in the blank? We'll start with you, Ms. Funkenhauser.
I'll say at this immediate moment, I actually don't have something in mind because I've been very focused on this hearing, but I do look forward to staying in touch as we work forward in this process.
Mr. Minor?
I think starting off with this hearing is a good idea. And I would like to continue a dialogue between, this committee and also the business community on a regular basis.
Because of the complication of the issue?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Well, I guess I would encourage Treasury to keep engaged and try to work as hard as they can to get a deal that's good for America.
Mr. Dunn. Mr. Bunn?
I think one of the things that could be helpful is some sort of trade promotion authority in the tax area specifically where Congress lays out priorities before the negotiations even begin.
I like that. Thank you all. I yield back. Thank you for the...
No, that's fine. You're going to have a couple of weeks. You'll be able to talk to the Secretary Treasurer will be here. It's really, I think it's encouraging the fact, that's why we're here today. So thank you all for being here. Dr. Ferguson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here. I must say, your answers regarding what Congress should be doing are much more kind than what I get out of my district most of the time. So thank you for your genteel responses. Ms. Funkhauser, let me start with a question to you. When we're looking at this proposal, this is a digital services tax, okay? So we're talking about taxing the services in the digital arena. So much of that is based on data and the value of data. Do you ever wonder then, given the fact that the U.S. has the highest quality data and the most tradable data in the world, does this open up, do you think that this avenue would open up problems with other countries taxing the value of our data? Not the services, but the value of the data. Do you see that as a concern?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Ferguson. And I'll say we have applauded the efforts of this committee as well as the administration when it comes to extending the World Trade Organization's moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, because this does get to some of what you're talking about when it comes to how companies are able to engage abroad and stay competitive. And so we see maintaining the moratorium on customs duties and electronic transmissions as critical to maintaining U.S. competitiveness.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bunn, when we look at the JCT score of this, I mean, their range is like $1 billion to 400 billion, right? I mean, do you think that it's responsible to be moving in this direction without more complete data and understanding exactly the impact that this would have?
Thank you for the question. So if you read through the JCT analysis, one word that pops up regularly is uncertainty. There's not, in my view, a point at which we will have much more certainty on those sorts of numbers than now. And that range, 100 million to 4.4 billion, that is a meaningful range. And again, it's a single year estimate, not a 10-year estimate like JCT is normally able to provide. But there's just so much complexity in the policy itself that this is not like changing the corporate tax rate and JCT being able to do that in their sleep. This is a very difficult and complex policy that makes it hard to estimate.
So advancing without the rules being written and understood seems pretty irresponsible to me at this point.
I agree. And one of the things that is uncertain is how companies, the data that the companies themselves would use to comply with this is not all sort of in one place or clearly available for analysis.
Okay, this question will be for whoever can answer it, and if I'll just kind of point as we go along here. Do you think that there's a situation where the money, the taxes levied here could wind up going to China at any level? Mr. Bunn, I'll start with you.
Yes, the allocation, yes.
That's fine.
Yes.
Ms. Sprague?
Well, I haven't seen statistics, but if China is a net beneficiary of Amount A, then they would be able to tax the net Amount A transfer, but I've not seen any statistics on this.
Okay, Mr. Minor?
But Dr. Ferguson, could I respond to your taxing data question?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, real quickly, let me get through this so we got enough time. Mr. Minor?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that issue.
Okay, Ms. Funkhauser?
No, I do not have statistics on that.
Okay, Mr. Sprague, back to you for just a quick response on the data.
Taxing data, yeah. No, it's a very interesting question, and the original DSTs actually tax the transfer of data. So one of the advantages of getting rid of the DSTs is to take away that tax that exists today in the DST countries on transfers of data. And keep in mind that the EC, not too long ago, proposed a general tax on data transfers. The tax world is in a very unstable place at the moment with ideas like the EC data tax, the DST, withholding tax on digital services. So to the extent that the system can be stabilized to get rid of all of those departures from international taxation norms, that I think is what would be good for U.S. business.
Okay, thank you for those comments. I'll say this, we should not be considering or supporting any legislation that that allows $1 of U.S. taxpayer money to go to the Chinese Communist Party. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Very good. Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I have to confess, I am not a tax attorney. I am an attorney, and sort of trying to wrap my head around Pillar 1 sometimes is like trying to wrap my head around the rule against perpetuity, which takes a while until you're familiar with it. So today we have heard some concerns about Pillar 1, but we also heard some suggestions for how we could improve it. And while some of my Republican colleagues are pulling the fire alarm, I just want us all to remember that these negotiations have spanned more than one administration, and in fact, most of the initial work on Pillar 1 happened under the Trump administration. But it's also important to keep in context the overall picture of Pillar 1 and what we were trying to do in terms of tax policy. And essentially, our American negotiators were trying to stop a trade war. They were defending American businesses who were openly targeted by other countries' digital service taxes. And U.S. negotiators have focused on trying to secure certainty for American companies. And that's a theme that I hear over and over from business. Certainty, stability, clarity are all important. So surely I think we all agree that we should protect American businesses against increasingly aggressive and confiscatory audits of their transfer pricing. And I think we should be focused in on how we can refine Pillar 1 to best protect U.S. interests without, again, forgetting why we entered these negotiations in the first place. Ms. Funkhauser, your industry is probably most directly targeted by DSTs. Can you describe what you think will happen if Pillar 1 fails?
Thank you for the question, and I think it's a critical question to keep in mind as we're considering this. And I think in the absence of a multilateral consensus-based solution, we will see further proliferation of unilateral, uncoordinated taxes that are imposed on gross revenues and are targeted to either a specific subset of companies, as we've seen in some of the DSTs to date with U.S. companies, or non-resident companies altogether. And so that would have a devastating effect on the international tax and trade environment.
And based on your experience following DSTs, do you think that aggressive taxes being pushed by other countries will stop at digital service taxes, or do you think that other countries will continue to try to find new and different ways to target U.S. companies?
We have already seen an increase in novel approaches, if you will, to taxation. I think the first generation of DSTs was focused on, like I meant, digital advertising, user data, et cetera. The next ones went to effectively anything that happens over the internet, as we see in India's equalization levy. And then we've also seen changes like the Australian Taxation Office's revised software payments ruling, which is looking at a new way of diverting from longstanding international tax norms.
So although we've heard concerns today about Pillar 1, and we've heard obviously some suggestions from our panelists about how we can improve and refine it within the parameters of how it currently exists, and I think my colleague Mr. Doggett said, what happens if the United States says, well, we don't like Pillar 1, we're just going to walk away from it? Does it really behove us to stick our head in the sand and hope that the problem of digital service taxes and other new problematic taxes by other countries are simply going to go away? Any of the panelists care to comment on that? That we should just walk away, blow it up, walk away?
No, I strongly support continued engagement by the U.S. government because, again, without strong engagement from the U.S. government, we cannot make this a better Pillar 1 deal for the U.S. economy and for U.S. competitiveness.
Anybody else care to chime in?
Yeah, I will.
About walking away?
The DSTs aren't going to just go away if Amount A or some other similar agreement is not negotiated and agreed to. I think the countries have made that pretty clear.
Mr. Bunn?
I would agree. The challenge here is to get an agreement that fits the priorities of this committee, this Congress, and I don't think that's the current draft, but to continue working towards that.
So it's worth it to roll up our sleeves, try to do the hard work, figure out what is the, negotiations are based on compromise as well, but what is the best deal that we can get and how can we best try to protect U.S. companies, U.S. innovation by sticking with the confines of Pillar 1. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I appreciate our panelists, and I yield back.
Mr. Estes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists today. You know, I've been concerned about the proliferation of the discriminatory digital services taxes since I came into office in 2017, which is why I encouraged the previous administration to engage with the OECD BEPS 2.0 project, which turned into the two-pillar process that we see today. The goals of this project were to eliminate DSTs, provide tax certainty, and simplification for businesses in the growing digital economy. And that's where the negotiations were going before the Biden administration came in and changed the direction. Well, I've been in ardent opposition to Pillar 2, the global minimum tax, especially the UTPR provision. I was hopeful that Pillar 1 would fulfill the stated goals of the original project. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that more countries like Canada are enacting DSTs, and the OECD issued a convoluted 800-page deal, quote unquote, that leaves more questions than answers. Because of this, it's my belief that this deal now represents a foot in the door for more extraterritorial taxes on successful businesses, and that it's a deal that's out there, but it's not necessarily that we should accept a bad deal. Additionally, the deal doesn't consider how businesses actually operate in the real world. Pillar 1's marketing and distribution safe harbor fails to adequately account for taxes paid in market jurisdictions under franchise or split ownership structures. This would force U.S. companies to over-allocate profits to market jurisdictions, resulting in more tax paid to foreign governments and less tax paid to the United States. As with the Biden Treasury Department's failure to grandfather guilty and failure to protect U.S. research and development incentives, the administration is once again failing to protect U.S. taxpayers and U.S. tax collections. I've heard from one U.S. Fortune 200 company that the failure to properly protect franchise or split ownership structures would result in an annual reallocation for that one company of $500 million to up to $1 billion of U.S. revenue to over 100 foreign countries, with significant share going to already wealthy countries like Germany and Spain. As my colleagues have noted, the recently released JCT report notes that a plurality of in-scope companies would be from the U.S., and 70%, or $135 billion of amount A, would be from American companies. Likewise, the U.S. Treasury would forego between $100 million and $4.4 billion, depends on that large range, per year of tax receipts, while we're granting a new tax right to other countries. It's my understanding that our Treasury Department is aware of the split ownership issue, has done nothing to fix it. Despite negotiating one of the most complex, confusing, and harmful deals that I've ever seen, the Biden administration claims that protecting our franchise and split ownership companies is just too complicated. I'm tired of hearing about this administration's hollow excuses. The massive reallocation of U.S. revenue is also not limited to U.S. companies operating in franchise or split ownership structures. Another U.S. Fortune 200 company that is highly profitable in the United States would be forced to reallocate between $500 million and $1 billion of U.S. revenue annually to European and other foreign countries, even though these foreign countries have no economic nexus in the U.S. revenue. So for just two countries, we're already up to almost $200 billion of U.S. revenue sent overseas. Mr. Minor, do you have any views of the marketing and distribution safe harbor and Treasury's failure to protect our U.S.-based franchise and split ownership structures?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. The two instances that you described are two of the issues that we've highlighted in our comments about making improvements to the marketing and distribution safe harbor calculation. But we have a number of issues with the MDSH based on the modeling of our member companies that it does not seem to fully eliminate double taxation based on those calculations. It's a unique formula. It's not related to the transfer pricing principles that are broadly adopted. So we also share your frustration that those two instances that you described have yet to be resolved. They may still be resolved. I think the other one relates to the autonomous domestic business exemption, which does not apply to U.S. consolidated groups. And we think there are good arguments consistent with the principle of that exemption that should allow carve-outs under certain conditions. And we hope that those suggestions are still in play.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, the JCT report underlines my ongoing concerns with Pillar 1's current structure. As a House Ways and Means Tax Subcommittee, we should be firm in our commitment to putting the United States first, maintaining our tax sovereignty, and not giving in to global demands. And the JCT analysis confirms that Pillar 1, as currently negotiated by the Biden administration, does not accomplish the original goals set out when we began this exercise in 2018. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Delbany, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for joining us today. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the concerns around discriminatory digital services taxes and the need to ensure that a Pillar 1 deal protects American businesses and workers against a patchwork of unilateral DSTs. That only happens if the United States continues to hold strong on demands for improvements to the current multilateral convention. Mr. Minor, if a critical number of countries were to sign and ratify the multilateral convention as it is drafted today, would that put an end to DSTs and relevant similar measures?
Well, that would for those jurisdictions that sign on to the Amount A, with the caveat that we still have problems with the way the DST review in the current version of the MLC is drafted, and so we've provided our advice on to how to improve on that. That does leave the issue of jurisdictions that decide not to sign up for the MLC. Under that situation, they're still free to pursue DSTs, but I am hopeful that there might be a trend then at that point against the proliferation of DSTs, because I think the U.S. still has a number of options to go forward against those jurisdictions as it sees fit, if that is the case.
Thank you. A top Canadian Finance Department official recently said that Canada is advancing its plan to impose a digital services tax, even though the U.S. is opposed, in part because the U.S. has not retaliated against 7 other countries, such as India, France, or Turkey, that have adopted DSTs. These countries' taxes were found by USTR to discriminate against American companies and workers. And following the USTR investigations, the U.S. agreed to impose and then immediately suspend tariffs on these countries as part of a political agreement, which was recently extended through June of this year, focused on reaching a multilateral agreement at the OECD. Ms. Funkhauser, what do you make of the contention that it's okay for Canada to impose a discriminatory tax because the U.S. has not yet retaliated against other countries with these taxes?
Thank you for the question, Representative Delbene, and thank you for all of your work with the Congressional Digital Trade Caucus to push back against DSTs, particularly the Canadian proposal. I do not agree with the contention that it would be okay for the Canadian government to move forward with this unilateral measure. It is modeled after the French DST. It's not identical, but it's very similar, which the USTR has found to discriminate against U.S. companies. And it also comes at a point in the multilateral negotiations that are trying to remove unilateral measures. And if the Canadian government moves forward, it could lead to perverse incentives to actually finalizing those multilateral negotiations.
So how do you think, well, I guess I was going to ask how that impacts the OECD process. And so you think that Canada's actions will impact the OECD process?
Yes, I believe that if the Canadian government moves forward with a DST, it could inspire similar actions from other governments, and then that would just increase the amount of perverse incentives you have when it comes to actually coming to a final compromise that provides for the reallocation of taxing rights and provides for the withdrawal of digital services taxes.
So their logic, if that holds, then anybody could say we're going to go adopt a tax that discriminates against it because others are doing it.
Yes, exactly, and that is not an adequate reason to do so. These are inherently bad taxes in structure and scope.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of the feedback from everyone on the panel. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kelly, for holding today's timely hearing. Before I move into questions, I just want to emphasize a few key points for my constituents back home who likely aren't following the OECD negotiations as closely as some of the tax community in Washington, but whose lives could be impacted by this. And I want to go back to the initial reason for the Pillar 1 discussions, as you've all said, were started with the intent of modernizing tax rules for the digital age. And the U.S. specifically entered into the discussions with the goal of reaching an agreement to remove discriminatory taxes, the DST taxes, on American companies, specifically American innovation, being enacted by several foreign allies. But the Biden administration chose to leave Congress out of the negotiations, and what we're left with is a Pillar 1 deal that has failed to achieve its original and its fundamental purpose, eliminating harmful digital service taxes, we're referring to them as DSTs, that threaten American jobs and will likely send U.S. tax revenue overseas. And because the Biden administration has chosen not to consult with Congress throughout those negotiations at OECD, I think today's hearing is an important opportunity to get the message out to the international community that Congress has serious concerns with Pillar 1. So I hope they're paying attention. For this deal to move forward, and I'll just maybe ask Mr. Bunn to confirm this, I mean, this cannot move forward unless the Senate ratifies the treaty and unless my colleagues and I on the Ways and Means Committee will need to advance change to the U.S. tax code as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so this doesn't get done unless we and the Senate agree with it as well. So it's important that folks are paying attention to that. We believe endorsing a deal that penalizes American innovation, that could cost American jobs, and could end up sending tax revenue to foreign countries, even as some of you suggested here in answer to Mr. Ferguson's question, even nations like China that are simultaneously attempting to steal our innovation, we don't think that's in the best interest of our constituencies. And let me ask the question, maybe Mr. Minor, is there any scenario in your estimation in which this proposal does not reduce or undercut U.S. federal revenue? Just keep in mind, half of the taxable companies are U.S. based. So this almost certainly will result in less revenue in the U.S. Do you agree with that?
Well, thank you for the question. That's a tough one for me. I would have to defer to my economist colleague.
Anyone else want to answer that?
I think JCT's analysis with the uncertainties, even with the uncertainties, the range, all of those numbers are negative. It seems likely that
in other words, there would be a reduction
in U.S.
coming
tax.
into the U.S.
Right. Even after accounting for additional revenues that could come from foreign companies, the net would be negative.
Does that make sense to you? I mean, if we're even discussing reforming taxes surrounding U.S.-based businesses, shouldn't those taxes be used to benefit U.S. citizens and not people of other countries?
I think one of the things, thank you for the question, I think one of the things inherent in this discussion is that tug and pull. Is this compromise, that reduction in U.S. tax revenue, worth it to get the certainty or the elimination of digital services taxes? And if those are questionable, then the sacrifice, in my view, is not necessarily worth it.
Yep. Ms. Funkhauser, would you like to respond to that as well?
Yes, I would. And Daniel touched on this at the end, but a part of this compromise in Pillar 1 is looking at bringing together a more predictable, certain, and stable tax environment. And so the JCT report is part of the picture when it comes to considering how Congress chooses to engage with Pillar 1. But I would highlight that companies are already paying digital services taxes, and they are impactful for all companies, regardless of profit margin, but particularly for those that are loss-making or low-margin companies. And there are some jurisdictions out there that don't even have revenue thresholds, and so startups and small businesses are also directly affected by these gross revenue taxes. And so I would encourage Congress to keep that in mind when considering the compromise of Pillar 1.
We've also heard some of you in answer to questions have said that this proposal will not eliminate all possible DSTs. And so we could essentially have a situation where the Biden administration has negotiated an additional foreign tax proposal on U.S. multinational companies while failing to eliminate the digital services tax. Anybody want to respond to that?
I'd like to respond to that. As Mr. Minor noted, the Amount Aid document actually lists the digital service taxes that are within scope and would need to be withdrawn. And it includes all of the, should we call it first wave DSTs, UK, France, Spain, Italy, India, Turkey. I'd be very surprised if UK, France, Spain, Italy did not sign on to Amount A, and so I would be extremely confident that those DSTs would indeed be withdrawn. Canada, I'd be surprised if Canada didn't sign on, in which case it would be precluded from asserting a DST.
Do you think any country, I'm sorry, I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but would you foresee any situation where countries would not sign on, where a DST tax would stay in effect?
Maybe small countries. I mean, there are some very small countries with DSTs.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Good line of questioning. Ms. Moore, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Mr. Sprague. There's been a lot of discussion about the JCT estimates of revenues that would be lost to $1.4 billion. Does that take into account the amount under B if it were mandatory? Would that mitigate the loss of revenue to the U.S.? Because I think one of the problems that I've been hearing is that because Amount B is not mandatory, the transfer pricing, that's part of the uncertainty.
You know, thanks, Congresswoman Moore, for the question. That's a very good question. There were a couple different points that I'd like to respond to. First, on Amount B, I do believe that the introduction of Amount B, assuming it's adopted broadly, would be a net revenue raiser for the U.S. And the reason is that I do think that Amount B will tamp down some of these aggressive foreign transfer pricing adjustments, and that means fewer foreign taxes that U.S. companies claim as foreign tax credits, and fewer correlative adjustments that U.S. companies would then claim in the U.S. So that's those are the two benefits of addressing, tamping down the aggressive foreign adjustments. We also need to think about the inbound side, right? Because Amount B, if the U.S. adopts it, would also be applicable to inbound distribution from overseas.
Exactly.
The IRS has just started, you know, a new project to look carefully at inbound distribution. My belief is that Amount B would not limit the IRS in its review of inbound distribution, and that project is likely to increase U.S. tax revenue. So I think both on the outbound side and the inbound side, the introduction of Amount B would be a net tax revenue raiser for the U.S. I can't say how much. It's not going to be in the same magnitude as Amount A, but it will be a counterbalancing number. The other element that I like to emphasize is that the $1.4 billion is only one part of the whole. You know, I think others, Ms. Funkhauser in particular, has mentioned that the deal is a deal that has lots of components. I mentioned that the international tax system today is in a very unstable state, and a lot of that instability, whether it's digital service taxes or withholding taxes on digital services, is directly impacting U.S. companies. If the Amount A goals are achieved, we'll restabilize the international tax environment, and that'll be good for U.S. business. U.S. business is the most multinational of any business, any country, and restabilizing the international tax framework is going to allow U.S. business to operate overseas with more predictability and more stability than is the case right now.
I got you. Let me ask Mr. Minor a question. We've heard a lot today about U.S. companies. The feedback we got in October was that they were concerned about the added complexity of complying with Amount A and then finding that they have very little tax liability. How can these compliances challenges be mitigated? And again, is it worth it to go through the complexity of complying with Part A? And would would it benefit the U.S. companies to do it even if they have a limited amount of tax liability so that they can, in fact, get those receipts incoming and also mitigate problems that they would have with aggressive transfer pricing?
Yeah, it's inherent in introducing a novel regime like Amount A that there's going to be significant compliance costs up front. But there's a lot of money at stake. So I guess on a proportionate basis, it's not an unusual ratio, the compliance cost to the amount at stake. And we have to remember, as Mr. Sprague just said, there are multiple components to the Pillar 1 project.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Funkenhauser, why should ordinary people care about Pillar 1?
That's a great question. Ordinary people should care about Pillar 1 from the perspective of how does it contribute to U.S. competitiveness and engaging with the global economy. Again, the U.S. economy benefits and contributes to, but benefits from, clearly, the global economy, and that's why it's important for providing that stability, predictability, certainty that benefits U.S. companies and U.S. workers.
Thank you so much for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I
Yes,
yield
ma'am.
back.
Yes, sir. Mr. Kustoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes. We will go 2-1 now in the interest of time, and thank you all so much for being patient with us. Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing as well. Pardon me, Mr. Minor, if I can with you, the Pillar 1 multilateral convention will now require companies to file, frankly, a substantial amount of sensitive financial information and tax information. In preparation for today's hearing, I was reviewing a letter submitted by the Business Roundtable. It was a comment letter to the Department of Treasury on the Pillar 1 MLC. And if I could, I wanted to read you part of it and then get your thoughts. This is from the letter dated December the 11th, 2023, from the Business Roundtable to the Department of Treasury. Regarding compliance, more information is needed as to the mechanics of filing returns, paying tax, and perhaps more importantly, the confidentiality of taxpayer information. The level of detail and the data required for calculation under the MLC is greater than under typical tax compliance rules. For that reason, there should be extra sensitivity to what is shared for Pillar 1 purposes. That's from the letter. So my question to you is, given the type and amount of information that companies will have to report under the MLC, are there any concerns or legitimate concerns about confidentiality risks?
Yeah, I guess that's a very valid risk, and that what you just read out loud sounded very similar to the language in our consultation letter on that topic, because of again, it's a novel regime, it's a multilateral regime, and so the dispute prevention and dispute resolution provisions are very detailed, very important. And one of our concerns was making sure that confidential information was only going to be shared with those jurisdictions who had a stake in any of that type of resolution review. So we're going to continue to emphasize this issue, but again, I think it's a reasonable concern to have, and we can't over-highlight that concern.
If I could, and I appreciate that, the letter goes on to say that stronger rules need to be in place where there are breaches of confidentiality, since there is such a wide variation in the protections provided among parties in their domestic law. Given the more sensitive nature of the data that would be incorporated into calculations under the MLC. So what mechanisms, if any, if you will, does the MLC include or need to include to address breaches of confidentiality?
Yeah, well, there need to be strong and clear consequences for breaches of any confidentiality. Also as a deterrent, but as an enforcement mechanism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bunn. With you, can you speak about why Pillar 1 will likely result in revenue loss to the United States?
Thank you for the question. As I've mentioned before, the analysis from the Joint Committee notes the uncertainties, but I'll describe a situation in which these numbers hopefully make a little bit of sense. A lot of high-value activity for U.S. multinationals happens in the U.S., and those profits are booked in the U.S. and taxed by the U.S. Treasury. The way the Amount A rules work, that if you have very high profit margins, 25% of profits over a 10% threshold could be subject to reallocation. So the U.S. as home to very innovative and highly profitable businesses, and where a lot of those profits are booked, will have an outsized share available for reallocation. Part of the reallocation is to where customers are. Now the U.S. is about 30% of worldwide consumption. So a lot of consumption happens outside the U.S. A lot of customers for U.S. businesses are outside the U.S. So you could see just from that kind of simple example that a lot of the profits available for reallocation could end up outside the U.S. Now the U.S. would also get some inward reallocation, and the inward reallocation could come from U.S. businesses that have foreign operations and they sell back into the U.S. market. And it could also come from foreign businesses that are selling into the U.S. market. But on net, the Joint Committee's analysis shows that it would be a net revenue loss, particularly looking at 2021 data.
Thank you, Mr. Bunn. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Feenster, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to each of the witnesses today. It's great to hear from you. I'm trying to understand whether there's any coherence between the steps this administration is taking in this sector. We started negotiating Pillar 1 for a large part in a response to the implementation of digital service taxes around the world, but more broadly to adapt international taxation to the digital economy. One of the advantages of doing Pillar 1, if at all, is that it would enable a paper reallocation of profits, not a physical one that is transferring economic activity, investment, and R&D to market jurisdictions. We want to keep all this here in the United States, but the abandonment of the moratorium of the digital trade by Biden administration, meaning by allowing local data storage requirements to proliferate, essentially creates a physical presence requirement in the market jurisdictions. So on one hand, at the OECD, we are negotiating for a paper reallocation of profits. On the other hand, at the WTO, we are negotiating a physical reallocation of profits. Though that's not the intent, it ultimately is the effect. So what I'm asking Ms. Funkhauser, I'm trying to reconcile these two seemingly contrasting objectives. Can you explain how the abandonment of the digital trade moratorium at the WTO, particularly the potential for the new local data storage, interferes with the goals of Pillar 1? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I do, Mr. Feenstra, and thank you for the question. I appreciate it. And as you mentioned, in October, the Biden administration withdrew support for some longstanding priorities in the World Trade Organization's plurilateral agreement on e-commerce. And these were priorities to prohibit data localization measures. And what this means, though, is that if there are no commitments against data localization, a government can then require that if a company wants to serve that market, then that company would have to actually set up physical presence in the market, which would then lead to permanent establishment and lead to a taxing presence. And so that would mean, though, that if a company can no longer do that same activity in the U.S. and has to then do it in the market to serve the market, correct, you then lose the opportunity. And so yes, we're very disappointed in kind of the direction of digital trade policy right now, and really encourage a priority that puts forward U.S. competitiveness.
Right. So can you just explain, how does that create a disadvantage for American multinational or American companies?
Mm-hmm. It means that if a company wants to do business in a market, then it actually has to physically go into that market and is not able to have those jobs and that activity in the United States.
Thank you. And that can be very significant.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I'm going to switch subjects now. So I also look at what the other countries are aggressively doing. They're shifting their tax burden on U.S. companies, and they're trying to find places where they can grab more dollars. We saw this in Europe. Obviously, Germany's extraterritorial tax on Section 49 similarly is targeting our U.S. firms for the sole purpose of raising revenue. We're seeing this also. Australia has designed its own tax targeted at U.S. software companies, and India is also frivolous in forcing U.S. companies in lots of litigation. What I'm trying to get at is this. Would you agree, Ms. Funkhauser, that American companies are typically targeted by foreign tax collectors? And do we see this proliferating? Obviously, we're talking about Pillar 1, but we're also talking about a lot of different aspects. How do we, as Congress, answer that, and what can we do as a country?
No, thank you very much. And you've really listed through the different ways there is uncertainty in the international tax environment now. And perhaps as a first point, just thank you so much for your leadership in leading letters and making clear your concerns about the imposition of Section 49 in particular on U.S. taxpayers. And I think that is a big part of is making clear that the U.S. economy and U.S. competitiveness, though, should not be faced with extraterritorial measures. And so thank you for the leadership you've shown in that regard.
Well, thank you. I mean, to me, this is very concerning, and I worry about this administration. It just seems like they're allowing this to occur. And this is very, very, we all have to be aware of what's happening. I mean, here we're losing our revenue, and the revenue is going somewhere else. So with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for sharing your perspectives on what is relatively a very clear and simple concept to understand. So thank you for allowing it. One thing that I know from my years in business before coming to Congress is two things that drive costs up are uncertainty and complexity. And we are certainly talking here about a situation with great uncertainty and great complexity, and the goal is to try to reduce that. Mr. Sprague, you used the term earlier, the international tax system is unstable, or at an incredibly unstable moment. Very briefly, because I want to touch on some other things, but what are the key implications of that instability for, in our focus, American multinational corporations?
Well, Mr. Feenstra's reference to the Section 49 tax is a perfect example. I mean, that was an opportunistic effort by Germany to tax the profits of U.S. multinationals. The cost to U.S. business of the uncertainty is the cost, the tax cost of these special taxes like Section 49 and DSTs, plus the expense of trying to plan a business when you don't have great visibility into what your tax liabilities are going to be. That is another advantage of Amount B, trying to bring into a more narrow range what your range of tax exposures is going to be in distribution activity in foreign countries.
Thank you. And I'm going to quote Ms. Funkhauser. You said in your opening remarks, absent robust U.S. engagement, including that of Congress, and I'll emphasize, my emphasis, Congress should be all caps and underlined because we have to be involved. There's little chance of resolving outstanding issues and crafting a final package that provides certainty and predictability for the global technology industry. And I think you can expand that to industry as a whole. My question for you, because we're talking about certainty and unpredictability, what's likely to happen if we walk away from the table for American technology companies?
Thank you very much for the question, because it is something we spend time thinking about, and it really would be a further proliferation of these unilateral, uncoordinated taxes that are imposed on a gross revenue basis, and in some ways are attempting to ring-fence the digital economy and are really presenting trade barriers to the ways that companies invested in the United States are able to engage with other markets around the world. And so the gross revenue base in particular is especially impactful for loss-making and low-margin companies. And so as you're thinking about companies that are in the United States and looking to expand elsewhere, the proliferation of DSTs is especially harmful.
And thank you. And we need to move forward on this. You also talked, Ms. Funkhauser, about the goal of Pillar 1 with predictability and certainty the Biden administration is working to make Amount B is mandatory, making sure all countries, Amount B is for all countries is the way we achieve that certainty within Pillar 1. Does anyone disagree that it should be mandatory?
I believe it should be mandatory for governments to adopt Amount B, and that companies should have an option when it comes to opting into Amount B, or or it should operate as a safe harbor. Again, if this is about simplifying transfer pricing, then that is how we would see it.
Mr. Minor, anyone else?
Yes, I agree. In my mind, mandatory is essential, and it should be seen as part of the overall deal for including Amount A as an important component of Pillar 1 and the elimination of DSTs.
Mr. Sprague?
I agree with both of those comments, including that it should be a mandatory integral part of 1, goes along with A.
Mr. Bunn?
I also agree that it should be mandatory.
Okay, as my time is winding down, let me ask another question. I'll just make it easier and raise your hand if you think the U.S. should stay at the table trying to achieve agreement on Pillar 1. So we got 4 out of 4. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll finish with one just thing as we're coming to the end. My friend, Chairman Kelly, mentioned Atlas. And there's often a misnomer of Atlas holding the world on his shoulders. It was actually the skies that Atlas held up. And Atlas was a titan, was a giant. I'd like to, and this may be torturing the metaphor, view the United States as a titan of innovation, as a titan of creativity. We've talked 50% of the multinationals that are affected are U.S. companies. I'm proud of the success and the innovation and the progress that U.S. companies make. And I want to make sure that whatever we do here ensures that those companies continue to be in the United States and that the sky is the limit for their potential. And with that, I yield back.
Well said. I agree with you. It's also nice that this committee is actually getting involved in it, and we're going to continue down that road because this is so complex. It's very difficult, but I thank you all for doing that. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member for allowing me to wave on to the subcommittee here today. Appreciate the concern so many have already expressed about the implementation of Pillar 1 and its impact on American businesses and innovations. It's clear that both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are bad for American jobs, American workers, and revenue to our Treasury. However, I'm also here today because I'm concerned that in addition to the other problems discussed here, Pillar 1 will stop international efforts will not stop international efforts to strip more revenue from American businesses operating abroad in the digital space, has been discussed somewhat here today already. Despite ongoing efforts with Pillar 1, Canada continues moving toward implementation, obviously, of its own DST, as was discussed, as do nations across Europe and around the world. Nations like Australia and Denmark, to name just 2, also continue to pursue domestic content requirements for streaming services, placing even more demands on American businesses. When policies like these are implemented by partners with whom the United States has trade agreements, they don't just undermine efforts to find a global standard, which Pillar 1's proponents say they are attempting to achieve. They also violate commitments made in trade agreements like USMCA and also the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. We need an agreement which limits the ability of foreign governments to unfairly tax American companies, and we need it to do more than merely stop a single method among the many that foreign governments are using to target them. Pursuing targeted trade remedies should never be the first resort, but I fear that ongoing international efforts to implement DSTs and other requirements intended to directly target American companies could lead us there. Mr. Bunn, in your opening statement, you reflected on international implementation of DSTs and the potential effect of DSTs and other requirements in the trade space. Will Pillar 1 in its current form put a stop to these efforts?
In its current form, Pillar 1 identifies some DSTs that would likely go away once countries sign on to it, but that's not the full scope or the full universe of these discriminatory policies.
And so,
so some of them would likely remain, or there would be new mutations to get around the definitions within Pillar 1.
And how would you propose moving forward to address some of these concerns?
That's the challenge. If we remove ourselves from this negotiation, then there's less leverage to try to tighten the rules in the context of the negotiation. And you mentioned targeted trade remedies. I'm not certain that those would be sufficient to change the policies of other countries without just an escalating trade war. This is the real puzzle of the problem. You can increase the types of tools or increase the leverage that the U.S. might have in those negotiations and kind of see how it goes, but I don't think there's a path outside of this multilateral negotiation that leads to more certainty on elimination of digital services taxes without some sort of trade war.
Well, thank you. I think that these perspectives are important, and that we continue to have this conversation. Obviously, we might have a separate trade subcommittee, but let's face it, trade policies from the Ways and Means Committee involve a lot of taxes in tax policies, and so we might have separate subcommittees, but we definitely need to work together and to think and strategize together on behalf of American jobs and innovation, and apply ideas moving forward that will not shortchange us in the big picture. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. That's a great perspective coming from the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee. Jimmy Gomez, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the title of this hearing, at first glance, and with some of my colleagues' testimony or statements, it seemed like my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were dead set on criticizing the Biden administration on just about anything, including Pillar 1, where the administration actually continues to actively fight for American interests by insisting on changes that will level the playing field for the U.S. There is actually a great deal of bipartisan agreement on the goals of Pillar 1. On Amount A, we agree that the U.S. should not be discriminated against with digital service taxes designed to target only American businesses, and that the rules to enforce this must be uniform throughout all jurisdictions. On Amount B, we agree that American companies and their subsidiaries should be able to operate across borders at arm's length in a stable international tax system, with wide scope, mandatory rules to ensure high certainty and low compliance cost. The administration has stated that they are for making Amount B mandatory and not optional, and a lot of us agree with that. When it comes to the cost of Pillar 1 or the effects on revenue, it is considered to be negligible. Some people would even say it's a rounding error, but it's a small price to pay for international tax certainty for American businesses. There seems to be consensus on the principles of Pillar 1. So it is strange to me that rather than supporting the Biden administration negotiating strategy of using our leverage to insist on provisions that level the playing field, critics on the other side of the aisle seem to prefer to tank a deal on Pillar 1 altogether. But what's the alternative? Continued good faith negotiations are the only thing preventing the worst outcomes. Sticking our heads in the sand and refusing to negotiate in good faith with the international framework will not make these challenges go away. As more commerce moves online, countries with suspended digital service taxes will re-implement them. And if we pull out of these negotiations with no alternative, other jurisdictions like Canada and the EU as a whole will join them. The previous administration threatened to escalate Trump's trade war by imposing retaliatory tariffs on key industries from countries that instituted digital service taxes. Ms. Funkhauser, who pays the price for the higher tariffs of a trade war? And will those consequences be worse than continue the Biden administration strategy of insisting on reasonable, good faith improvements to Pillar 1?
Thank you very much for the question, Representative Gomez. I mean, at the end of the day, global tax policy challenges require global tax policy solutions, and that's why ITI has been so supportive of administrations, going back several administrations now, participating in good faith in those negotiations to secure a more predictable and certain international tax system. And so That is what is going to be the best outcome for U.S. competitiveness, is a domestic and international tax environment in which companies have the certainty so that they can make investment, so that they can pursue R&D, and so that they can engage with other markets. Thank you.
Mr. Sprague, do you see any viable alternatives to avoiding DSTs and trade wars other than the administration continuing multilateral Pillar 1 negotiations while insisting on common sense changes like a mandatory Amount B?
I really think that continuing engagement on the Amount A concept is the only realistic way the DSTs will go away. If there isn't a treaty like Amount A, I would expect the existing DST taxing countries to retain them and other countries like Australia to impose them.
Thank you. One thing I want to make clear is that the Congress should be involved, but the administration has the correct position of negotiating. And people shouldn't assume negotiating is a sign of capitulation or weakness when it comes to American interests or putting America first. I think it is the appropriate course of action, and if things do not work out, we always have other tools in the toolbox to address violations or discriminatory treatment of American companies. With that, I yield back.
Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kelly and Ranking Member Schneider, and to thank you to all 4 of you witnesses for being here today. I've been acutely concerned with the actions taken by the OECD and the Biden administration's failure to protect American interests over the course of the past several years. I traveled to the OECD with Chairman Smith and my colleagues last summer to tell these unelected globalist bureaucrats that they are going down the wrong path and the U.S. tax base is not a piggy bank for Europe's socialist policies. These failed negotiations have left the United States in a much worse place than when President Trump started the process to protect our interests from the rising threats of the digital services taxes. Biden's Treasury negotiators were either asleep at the wheel or actively undermining U.S. companies, which will result in our tax dollars and jobs being sent overseas. Either way, this result is unacceptable. In the coming months, Treasury must do everything in its power to mitigate the damage that they've caused at the OECD. The whole point of these negotiations was to protect U.S. companies from the digital service taxes, but France, Canada, and other countries have already moved forward, and the OECD process is unlikely to solve this issue. As President Trump once wrote in The Art of the Deal, the worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is to seem desperate to make it. This makes the other guy smell blood, and then you're dead. I urge President Biden to heed the advice of his predecessor and hopefully successor. Mr. Bunn, can you go into further detail on why the U.S. is negotiating at the OECD on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in the first place?
Thank you for the question. I think a little bit of the history of this is going to, I think, shed light on where we've come relative to where we were a few years ago. So after the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, other countries looked at our policies like GILTI and said, well, maybe there can be a global agreement based off of this newly designed U.S. tax tool. We could call that a global minimum tax. And at the same time, with the digital services taxes that were being adopted, it looked like a decent path forward would be multilateral negotiation to eliminate those. Back in 2019, and Secretary Mnuchin sent a letter to the OECD that outlined concerns with the direction for Pillar 1 and suggested that maybe this should be an optional route for companies. And in my view, this is my interpretation of the letter, is that if there was going to be a new multilateral agreement on allocating taxing rights, that the design of that should be attractive enough with certainty and stability and things of that companies may want to opt into that. And then separately, the position of the Trump administration was to look at what was being negotiated on the global minimum tax and say, Other countries, you're welcome to do that, but as long as it doesn't implicate U.S. law and require U.S. law change. Where we are today is as we talk about Amount B, there are countries that are looking at Amount B and saying, well, we might want that to be optional. And on the global minimum tax side, the agreement has already eroded part of the U.S. tax base on GILTI. So that's where we've come from. Or the journey we've been on over the last several years with these negotiations, and it's not clear that there's an opportunity to move back to that previous negotiating position.
It's a shame. Mr. Minor, can you explain how the current definition of digital services taxes in Pillar 1 fail to meet the moment, and how could these definitions be improved in further negotiations to protect U.S. interests?
Yeah, so under the current language, there is some there is some flexibility that an aggressive jurisdiction can simply see how the DST is defined and then draft its version of what I would then call DST that does not fall within the forbidden elements of the DST prohibited under the current draft of the MLC. There's also an interesting exception for policy for imposing a DST in the current MLC, which looks like more of a political provision than a technical provision. So we've called for there must be a more airtight version of the definition of DST to keep jurisdictions, prevent jurisdictions from being tempted to plan around what definition is in the MLC now.
Okay, one more quick question. Would Pillar 1 be an easier way to comply with in its current form, or would it make matters worse?
Well, it's still being amended, and so it's difficult to come to that conclusion until we've seen the final text of the MLC.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. So Mr. Schneider and I were just talking back and forth here. This is the first time I've ever been in a hearing like this where nobody said this is the Republican witness, this is the Democrat witness, as opposed to these are all people who are concentrating on policy and not politics. So I think if we start looking at our time here and what we're able to actually do, first of all, for the four of you to leave what you do every day to come here, God bless you. The only thing that's worse is having to come here every day. But what we're talking about, this is so incredibly hard to understand. But for you to come and talk with us, and I think we'll continue down this road. I think the one thing that Mr. Schneider and I agree on, Congress has a role to play. My big concern always was from the beginning, when do we actually get involved? And I think if you want to talk globally, the rest of the world looks at us and says, when the United States get weak, somehow we get stronger, except when something tragic happens in the world, we're the first responder to every single thing that happens out there. So it's really incredibly important that we have a very strong economy. I'm going to fall off my stump here in a minute, but I mean this sincerely. Thank you all for taking the time, and thank you all for your expertise to come here. We sure appreciate it. So with that, meeting is adjourned.